Welcome back to American History 130, Lecture 2 of the Day 5 lecture series on the colonial history of America, which will focus on New England and the Middle Colonies. So without further delay, let's keep rolling. At first, the English regarded the northern part of North America as a place in which only the mad French could possibly see a future. English fishermen English fishermen who strayed from Newfoundland to the coast of Acadia and New England carried home descriptions of the long, lonely coast, rock-bound and rugged. Long winters and numbing cold melted into short summers and steamy heat. There were no minerals to mine, no crops suitable for export, no huge native populations to enslave, and as a result, the English weren't that interested in what is present day today, the northeast of the United States. The Chesapeake, with its temperate climate and a long growing season, seemed like a much likelier spot to settle. But by the 1620s, worsening conditions at home, that is in England, had instilled in some English men and women the mixture of desperation and idealism needed to settle an uninviting, unknown world. Religious differences among English Protestants became a matter of sharper controversy during the 17th century. Along with the religious crisis came mounting political tensions and continuing problems of unemployment and recession. The same things that often drove indentured servants, for instance, to the Chesapeake colonies were also making splits within English society along religious lines. The colonization of New England started with a king who chose his enemies unwisely. James I, shortly after succeeding Elizabeth I in 1603, vowed to purge England of all radical Protestant reformers. The radicals James had in mind were the Puritans. The Puritans were reformers within the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, during the 16th century, who ultimately formed the Congregationalist and Presbyterian churches. Puritans strove to reform English religion, society, and politics by restricting church membership to the pious and godly, and by enlisting the state to enforce a very strict moral code. But because the English monarch refused to take a stronger, that is the English crown, refused to take stronger measures to reform the church and society, Puritans became their outspoken critics. Elizabeth I had tolerated this opposition, but James I would not endure it and intended to rid England of these radicals. With some of the Puritans known as the Separatists, he seemed to succeed. The Separatists were devout Congregationalists who concluded that the Church of England was too corrupt to be reformed. They abandoned Anglican worship and met secretly in small congregations. From their first appearance in England during the 1570s and 80s, the Separatists suffered persecution from the government, fines, imprisonment, and in a few cases even execution. By 1608, some had become so discouraged that they migrated to Holland, where the Dutch government permitted complete freedom of religion. But when their children began to adopt Dutch customs and other religions, some Separatists decided to move again, this time to Virginia. It can only be imagined what fate would have befallen the unworldly Separatists had they actually settled in the Chesapeake region. But a series of mistakes, including an error in charting in the course of their ship, the Mayflower, brought the little band far to the north to a region Captain John Smith had earlier dubbed New England. In November 1620, some 88 Separatist pilgrims set anchor at a place they called Plymouth, on the coast of present-day southeastern Massachusetts. They were sick with scurvy, weak from malnutrition, and shaken by a shipboard mutiny, and neither the site nor the season invited settlement. Pilgrims could have foreseen founding the first permanent European settlement in New England, and many did not live long enough to enjoy the distinction. They had arrived too late to plant crops and had failed to bring an adequate supply of food. By the spring of 1621, half of the immigrants had died. English merchants who financed the Mayflower voyage failed to send supplies to the struggling settlement. Plymouth might have become another doomed colony, except that the Pilgrims received better treatment from native inhabitants than they did from their English backers in the mother country. Though they understood it only dimly, the Puritans were, in fact, in one historian's words, the beneficiaries of catastrophe. Remember, just only years before their arrival on the New England coast, the local indigenous population had suffered from a massive epidemic, possibly the plague or smallpox. Losses varied locally, but overall the native coastal population may have been reduced by as much as 90%. Abandoned villages lay in ruins up and down the coast, including the native village of Pauxet, where the Pilgrims established Plymouth years later. The Pilgrims set up a government for their colony, the framework of which was the Mayflower Compact, drawn up on board ship before landing. That agreement provided for a governor and several assistants to advise him, all to be elected annually by Plymouth's adult males. In the eyes of English law, the Plymouth settlers had no clear basis for their land claims or their government, for they had neither a royal charter nor approval from the crown to settle. But English authorities were distracted by a number of other problems at home, and as a result, this little tiny Plymouth colony was allowed to prosper. Among the crown's distractions were two groups of other Puritans more numerous and influential than the Pilgrims. They included both the Presbyterians and the majority of Congregationalists who, unlike the Pilgrim separatists, still considered the Church of England capable of being reformed. But the 1620s brought these Puritans only fresh discouragements. In 1625, for instance, Charles I inherited his father's throne and all of his enemies. When Parliament attempted to limit the king's power, Charles simply dissolved it, and in 1629 proceeded to rule without it. When Puritans pressed for reforms and called Charles' actions ridiculous and unconstitutional, the king began to move against them. This persecution swelled a second wave of Puritan migration that also drew from the ranks of Congregationalists. Unlike the humble separatists, these immigrants included merchants, landed gentlemen, and lawyers who organized the Massachusetts Bay Company in 1629. Those able Puritan leaders aimed to build a better society in America, an example to the rest of the world. Unlike the separatists, they had a strong sense of mission and destiny. Despite the company's Puritan leanings, it somehow obtained a royal charter confirming its title to most of present-day Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Advance parties in 1629 established the town of Salem on the coast of the well-known north part of Plymouth. In 1630, the company's first governor, a tough-minded and visionary lawyer named John Winthrop, sailed from England with a dozen other company stockholders and a fleet of men and women to establish the town of Boston. This became known as the Puritan Great Migration. Once established in the Bay Colony, Winthrop and other stockholders transformed the charter for their trading company into the framework of government for a new colony. The company's governor became the colony's chief executive, and the company's other officers became the governor's assistants. The charter provided for annual elections of the governor and his assistants by company stockholders, known as freemen. But to create a broad base of support for the new government, John Winthrop and his assistants expanded the freemanship in 1631 to include every adult male church member. Contrary to expectations, New England proved more hospitable to the English than actually the Chesapeake. The character of the migration itself gave New England settlers an advantage, for most arrived in family groups, not as young single indentured servants like that witnessed in the Chesapeake. The heads of New England's first households were typically free men, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Most were skilled and literate. Since husbands usually migrated with their wives and children, the ratio of men to women within the population was also fairly evenly balanced, I should say. Most of the immigrants, some 21,000, came in a cluster between 1630 and 1642, again referencing the Great Migration. Thereafter, new arrivals tapered off because of the outbreak of the English Civil War. This relatively rapid colonization, however, fostered solidarity because immigrants shared a common past of persecution and a strong desire to create an ordered society modeled on the Bible. Although most New Englanders called themselves Puritans and Congregationalists, few actually were living up to the terms as dictated by early reformers of what that actually, or what it meant to be a Puritan or Congregationalist. In other words, a lot of people disagreed about what it was to create a city on the hill in the New World and start a new society based on the teachings and Scripture of God. And what happened was, because there was these disagreements, many splinter groups broke off to form their own colonies. One of those colonies was formed in Connecticut, the first English settlement of Connecticut in 1636. While Connecticut and later on New Haven emerged from voluntary migration, enforced exile filled Rhode Island with men and women whose radical ideas unsettled the rest of Massachusetts. Roger Williams, Rhode Island's founder, had come to New England in 1631, serving as a respected minister of Salem. But soon Williams announced that he was a separatist, like the Pilgrims of Plymouth. He encouraged the Bay Colony to break all ties to the corrupt Church of England. He also urged a more complete separation of church and state than most New Englanders were prepared to accept, and later in his career, he endorsed full religious toleration. Finally, Williams denounced the Bay's charter, the legal document that justified Massachusetts' existence, on the grounds that the king had no right to grant land that he had not purchased from the Indians. These ideas were very radical. When Williams boldly suggested that Massachusetts actually inform the king of his mistake, angry authorities prepared to deport him. Instead, Williams fled the colony in the dead of winter to live with Native Americans. In 1636, he became part of the founder of the first Citizen of Providence, later to be a part of Rhode Island. Another charismatic heretic from Massachusetts arrived soon after. Anne Hutchinson, a skilled midwife and the spouse of a wealthy merchant, came to Boston in 1634. Enthusiasm for her minister, John Cotton, started her on a course of explaining his sermons to gatherings of her neighbors, and then elaborating essentially on Cotton's ideas, bringing her a lot of attention. The fact that a woman would do such a thing as question the authority or elaborate on the words of a man made many authorities uneasy. They became positively alarmed when they learned that Hutchinson embraced controversial positions on the doctrine. Soon, a majority of the Bay's ministers accused the popular Hutchinson of holding heretical views, or views that were in line with the church.